Thank you very much. Deborah Pembroke, I think if you could speak to your personal experience and what you're doing now.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you so much. I really want to thank the committee for having us all here today. So I'm Deborah Pembroke. I'm chair of a regional coalition on the Central Coast in Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. Our area is known for our strong agriculture, our beautiful beaches, our redwoods, and as being centers of tourism. Our coalition has brought together partners in working to end human trafficking, groups that had formerly been in silos. And I would like to share with you what we've been doing to bring law enforcement and legal resources together, as well as service organizations, to work on both CSEC in our community and also labor trafficking, particularly in agriculture in our area. But first, I also wanted to share a bit about myself. I'm a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. From when I was a small child in early elementary school through when I was 17, I was taken by a trusted adult to hotels and a truck stop where I was sold and exploited. In order to get out of the trafficking situation I was in, I had to leave everyone and everything I knew to relocate and change my identity and effectively go into hiding for many years. It was a very difficult thing to do as a teenager. Within weeks of leaving the situation I was in, I started having symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks. I had limited access to the legal, the legal help as well, but also, yeah.
Yeah, just move it closer.
Okay. So how's that?
A little closer.
Okay.
You can't get too close. Just move the microphone.
Okay. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's
there
much
we are.
better.
And I had limited access to medical resources, legal resources that I needed to help me in the situation I was in, including access to mental health resources. What was helpful to me was the community college system and the UC system, and particularly Cabrillo College and UC Santa Cruz. Although I didn't really have the language as a young adult to really understand what I had been through, through education, I was able to build a life of safety and have a career, build safety with my stable family life and connections in my community. I want to hold this vision of every survivor of every form of human trafficking in our community, not just ending the exploitation in their life, but truly having a whole and complete life, ending the after effects of human trafficking and really being welcomed into our community. And I'd like for all of us to hold that vision for all survivors. I mentioned earlier that our coalition had come together around human trafficking in our area, Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. One way that has been particularly effective has been a tri-county approach to a tri-county CSEC program. Is effectively bringing people together around commercially sexually exploited children, taking them out of the probation system, as we've been hearing about, and moving them into a child welfare system. As recently as March of 2014, during a sting operation in Santa Cruz County, a group of 8 women were arrested, and when one of the girls was identified as a minor, even though clearly under federal law this was a human trafficking victim, but she was booked under suspicion of loitering for prostitution charges and sent to juvenile hall, where she had incredible difficulty accessing services. So this year, our CSEC program is dedicated to making sure that never happens again in our Tri-County area. With the passage of SB 855, we've brought together our district attorney's office, victim witness, law enforcement, behavioral health, our school system, service agencies, and survivor advocates to create a memorandum of understanding as an alternative protocol when a commercially sexually exploited youth is identified. Now, within 90 minutes of when an emergency case is identified, children and teens have a team of trained responders, including a CSEC advocate. One of the issues we're struggling with in our community is how networked traffickers are. Most human trafficking survivors in our 3 counties, when they're identified, are not from our 3-county area. So we are trying to find and identify the same level of wraparound services for the survivors who, almost to a one, are from elsewhere in California, so that they have the same level of care that we'd want to create, that we're creating in our Tri-County area. So although our Tri-County approach is recognizing that these geographic boundaries don't mean much to the traffickers, we really see the need for a statewide solution, that survivors have statewide access to a network of services. I also want to speak about labor trafficking in our area, specifically in agriculture. And I really see that one of the issues is that we separate labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is so similar to sex trafficking that it can be harmful to separate them. And an example I'd give is that our Tri-County CSEC approach would have been much stronger if it was also addressing labor trafficking of children as well as commercial sex trafficking of children. Whether you look at the vulnerability of who is targeted, how they're targeted, the traumatic impact and the after effects, sex and labor trafficking are far more similar than they are different. And so I encourage you to move away from further legislation that continues to separate these categories. And of course, as I talk about agricultural trafficking, it's truthfully just one form, it's just one industry that has labor trafficking, but it's what we've seen most dramatically in our area. So we have heard accounts of survivors being trafficked in the fields, in fields that the food that they are growing is then packaged by the growers with nationally recognized labels that, food that we all eat every day. But because the growers are outsourcing and using subcontractors for all of their labor trafficking, that it's subcontractors who are creating these unethical work practices. So we've heard accounts of subcontractors locking workers in basements and in houses, not letting them go out at night unless they're with an armed escort, withholding wages, often with an empty promise that they'll be paid at the end.
Are these primarily children or children and adults?
These are often families. So it includes children. It also includes U.S. citizens. Cases where threats against members of a family are used to control all the workers. So parents are told that they're threats against their children are given threats against their parents. Parents have threats against their children. Particularly teen workers are very vulnerable. And because it's families, it's also mixed status. So different, families can include U.S. citizens, DACA kids, and also people who are undocumented.
Okay. If you could take about another minute to finish up.
Well, good. Then let me just say thank you, how much I appreciate this opportunity to come and talk with at this hearing. And I really want to commend the panel for making sure that survivors' voices are included in events like this. California has many different brave and survivor leaders who are doing wonderful work in ending human trafficking. So thank you for this chance.
All right. I'll just make a comment here, and perhaps you can respond to it. Both from D.A. O'Malley and from yourself, when we talk about sex trafficking, you're primarily talking about the children, some of whom may be trafficked, some of whom may be just runaways that are using sex to survive, and they're not trafficked per se, but they're certainly, in my opinion, should be treated as victims because they're not on the street because they had a wonderful home environment and they have a lot of other alternatives. They're on the street because they have problems. To what extent do you see trafficking as adults as an issue as opposed to children for sex work?
Yeah, we definitely see that as an issue. We actually just recently had a case where, in some cases, it's an adult who's able to really, is educated and able to really articulate to us, help me, this is a human trafficking situation, using the language of human trafficking. In other cases, it's adults who are, very traumatized, and it's a process of defining for themselves what the experience is. But we are seeing all of the components of the federal statute, force, fraud, and coercion. Sometimes even just trickery, with people who thought that it was one thing and it turns out to be another.
And they get something. The other question is, do you also see people being brought in effect, they're brought in for a visa for one purpose, but they're there voluntarily. They know they're going to get into sex trafficking. Let's just say for all practical purposes that they're paid fairly. Does this also exist, that you have people coming over voluntarily and being in the sex trade?
Oh, and specifically for, I thought we were talking about, so in labor trafficking, we certainly see that.
So these are people who are perhaps in the country illegally, but they're here voluntarily knowing they were going to be in the sex trade industry. Does that also happen?
I might want to broaden that out to the panel. I haven't seen that in our area.
All right, that's fine. I know, Alexandra, you apparently have an answer to that. Does that also exist?
Yeah, I think people try to get into this country for a lot of really good reasons, and sometimes their way in is knowing someone's going to help them get across the border, get into the country, and in exchange, they're going to be involved in prostitution to pay back whatever fees for helping them migrate. And so they're aware of the dynamic that they're agreeing to, and that seems like their best option for getting to a country where they think they'll have more opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So there, it's very important probably to have the U and T visas available. Yeah. Stephanie, would you like to speak next? And you can start off with your response to this, and then you can give me, say, 5 minutes, and try not to go over 10.
Okay, I just wanted to respond that I think what's important to acknowledge with individuals who are coming from other countries is what can start as voluntary migration or voluntarily being smuggled into the country can become sex or labor trafficking. We also know that people can consent to prostitution if they are an adult, so not all, as we've heard from many of the panelists today, not all women in prostitution are sex trafficked. So, you can know that you might work in prostitution, but then when force or other conditions that you didn't expect, like your debt doesn't go down, you can then become a sex trafficking victim. So just because you knew you might work in prostitution or because you consent to the voluntary migration does not make you someone who's not a victim. It doesn't necessarily make you a victim either. So it is a complicated assessment for each individual. And so we at CAST have definitely seen situations where people knew that they were going to work in prostitution, and we identified them as a trafficking victim. But we've also identified many people who were working in prostitution voluntarily and were not eligible for our services.
So go ahead to your prepared statement.
So sorry to jump ahead for that question, but my name is Stephanie Richard, and I'm the Policy and Legal Services Director at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. When I started working in the anti-trafficking movement over 10 years ago, and I told people I worked on trafficking, they thought that I helped people with traffic tickets as an attorney. And then when I, for about 5 years, then people just assumed that we worked internationally, so in Cambodia or Russia or Thailand. And so it's only really been in the last 3 to 5 years that I've seen this awakening and understanding of human trafficking here happening in our own backyards in California. And of course, that's what CAST do. We are probably the first service provider in the whole United States exclusively serving victims of modern-day slavery. We were founded back in 1998 in response to a large labor trafficking case involving 72 Thai workers. And at that time, there was no knowledge of what trafficking really was. And that's really how we got started. We started grassroots in the community, and we have continued with that ever since. So we offer what we call comprehensive services, including providing intensive case management, shelter, and legal services, as well as training and outreach, and really close partnership with federal and state law enforcement. And I like to say that unlike a lot of service providers, we really take seriously bringing what we see in practice to the policy realm, both at the state and the federal level. And we have one of the largest caseloads of trafficking victims in the country, so I feel like if we're seeing a problem with it, and because California has been such a leader in this area, we can really fix it, and we have that political impetus to fix things. But what I've also seen is that there's been a lot of political energy being used to create solutions that actually don't do anything for trafficking survivors or actually have unintended consequences. So that's going to be the focus of my remarks today. The other thing that I just want to highlight about CAST services before I jump into those is that we do host what's called the National Survivor Network. So not only do our recommendations come from practitioners working in the field, but it also comes from network survivors who have taken a stance and have wanted to be part of change. And so we actually have survivors represented from 25 different countries, including the United States, and they represent 27 different states. And what's unique is that we also work with sex and labor trafficking victims, men, women, and children, transgendered individuals. And so what we see is the commonality in the trafficking context is the commercial exploitation of someone. And so I want to echo the message that Deborah sent, that when we compartmentalize trafficking between sex and labor, I think we're not recognizing that if you actually speak with survivors, they actually feel a connection because of the type of exploitation and coercion they faced. And so we want to really not also complicate some of the solutions we need and compartmentalize these very similar types of victims. So when we look at who are trafficking victims, I know that you love data, and I want to say that CAST actually created a customized database 2 years ago to try to really effectively track the clients we're serving. 2 years of data when you don't have a huge population you're serving, our current caseload is 196, is not significantly significant, but we are sort of seeing the results of that. And so I have a document that I'm going to pass out that just, it's the first time I've tried to use the data for a policy thing, so forgive it for any inadequacies, but it is new to us as a smaller service provider. But our youngest client that we served was 2, our oldest was 75. And, as I said, we've served clients in so many different industries, including commercial sex, but things like agricultural, beekeeping. But I also want to highlight that we've served labor trafficking victims who are forced to commit illegal acts, like stealing for their trafficker and or selling or bringing in drugs. So you are seeing that criminalization also of trafficking survivors that you see with sex trafficking as well. So I always say that traffickers are exploiting people in every industry that we're using. I can't enjoy Christmas anymore. I can't enjoy honey with my tea because of the knowledge that I have of how it is. So although I agree with all my colleagues who presented before me, the data is one of the hugest issues in the anti-trafficking movement to be able to solve this problem. What I don't want you as legislators to think is that it isn't a problem because we don't have the data. We need to be moving forward with solutions and resources, even when we don't have perfect data, because we know that it's much more prevalent than I think we have numbers on. I do want to highlight that there is one report. It was put out by the Ohio Attorney General in 2010. Okay, and it's the only report that I've ever seen that estimates the prevalence of trafficking in a state at any given time. So the U.S. government has never put out a figure ever on the prevalence of trafficking in the U.S., and all the law enforcement data I think is really hard because it's just showing who's being prosecuted, and so it's not really giving you a sense of, well, who is actually enslaved. And so again, I'm not a statistician, but the Ohio General report said that there was about 1,000 U.S. citizen children in sex trafficking at any given time in the state of Ohio. And they said that there was about 873 sex and labor trafficking for national victims at any given time in the state of Ohio. So I like to use those numbers to say if Ohio has 2,000 people trafficked, then this is a problem.
Okay, but when it says there's, I think it was 1,000 children?
Yeah, about 1,000.
When they're saying they're trafficked.
And that's only
is
for
that
sex
all,
trafficked.
But
So no labor trafficking it in.
Okay, but the point here is that we know that there are children who run away. No one's forcing them on the street. They're doing it because that's the only alternative they feel they have. It's awful. We have to help them. But when that says there's 1,000 being trafficked, are 600 of those being trafficked and 400 on the street voluntarily? Does it make that distinction?
No, that report does not. But I do want to say that under our state and our federal law, any child who's induced to perform a commercial sex act is a sex trafficking victim by definition.
But what we heard from Alexandra was that, or I think it was your number, that roughly 40% are on the streets by themselves. Mm-hmm. But they tended to be counted as trafficked anyway. I'm not sure we really need to make a distinction because one way or another they ought to be helped, but it's just a matter of the great confusion we have in these numbers. And when you don't distinguish, you might think you're solving a problem if you can get all the adults out of trafficking children, and you still might have 40% of them on the street because they don't feel they have an alternative, and that's why they're there. So I think it's important that we get all of them off the street, and it's also important to realize that there are different circumstances, and that's the difficulty I have with putting every child as a trafficked victim as opposed to every child as a victim, and then some are trafficked and some are not.
Not to disagree with you, but what I feel like the needs for those kids are, whether they have a third-party exploiter or not, they're almost exactly the same. And so putting the services in place and identifying them as a trafficking victim benefits, I think, all those children. Okay?
And I would agree with that. The question is the solution for the two types may differ. For those, for example, who are being forced, you get the person who's forcing them to traffic themselves, as happened to Deborah. You get them away, and they're not going to go back. But you have that other 40% who are out there because this is how they knew how to make money, and you get them away from it, and they're likely to go back. So I think we have to look at these populations as different and having different solutions.
I'm not exactly certain that I would say that either, because I would say that the law enforcement approach is too late. What you want to say is, I want to early identify and prevent these groups of kids from ever engaging in commercial sex, whether it's a third party that's exploiting them or not. And therefore, the solution is very similar, right? To have access to shelter, to have extra access to work. If a parent or someone is abusive, for that child to have someone else to turn to support them. So again, and then I would like to say that the dynamics you see with someone with a trafficker and then someone who doesn't have one, most of the kids that we work with who are working for a trafficker believe that they're doing it consensually. And so the mentality can be very, very similar. So it's not about like what type of victim you are, unless you're looking at who should you prosecute. But if you're looking at how should you protect this victim the most, the services and needs are really, really similar. And what we have is we're not treating these kids as victims now, we're criminalizing them.
Right, and I agree with you, that ought to change.
So when we're looking at key recommendations for overall policy change, I wanted to just put out 4 rules of thumb that I like to look at when I'm analyzing if it's something we will support. So the first is this recommendation funded? So there's been a lot of anti-trafficking work out there that could have been good, but there was no funding attached. So the law enforcement training that we saw, there's a human trafficking caseworker privilege that was enacted in 2006, but the Cal OES hasn't put out the 40 hours of training you need to qualify for that. Or the idea that law enforcement is identifying so many more of these individuals, but saying that we have to put them in jail because there's nowhere else to shelter them, right? So the next thing is, does this recommendation cover all victims of human trafficking? That's sex and labor, U.S. citizens and foreign nationals, men, women, and children. And it's okay if you say, no, it doesn't, but then you have to ask why. Because what I want to ask is, why are we committing political capital for maybe helping just child sex trafficking victims when all victims could have benefited? And so I would like to compliment Assemblymember Santiago's legislation for child witnesses, that there's a reason it has to deal with kids because of some of the constitutional claims, but then he made sure that it covered both labor and sex trafficking children as witnesses. And having stood in a courtroom with both types of victims, this type of new protection, I think, is one that has significant merit, and I hope you consider. The next thing that I would ask is make sure that you talk with practitioners and survivors who are in the field about a piece of legislation. So a good example of a piece of legislation that hasn't worked is the new expungement legislation that passed last year. So we've now tried to use that piece of legislation in four different of our sex trafficking cases after the regular expungement provisions got dismissed, and got denied, and it got denied every time. So basically our assessment is the legislation does nothing more for victims of trafficking than we already had under the law. And so again, it's something that we can fix, but we could have fixed it before it was passed, and then we expended the energy trying to use it. And then finally, my last recommendation is that think about the unintended consequences. And I think we heard that from the Sex Worker Rights Project's representatives and from the Defense Counsel Bar. I can't tell you how many adult women in prostitution are now being arrested or are more at risk because of a lot of the voices in the anti-trafficking movement that we do not stand with. So we stand with protecting all individuals and their human rights, and we want to make sure that as we're trying to deal with the complicated issue of human trafficking, we're not causing other unintended consequences. And then, so in my final statement, and I'm sorry that I've gone over, is just, if you're going to look at the priorities that we need to consider for next year's legislative cycle, the first is resources. So I just want to congratulate the legislator last year on passing $10 million, not just for children, but for all trafficking victims, and to be used for specialized services. In addition, we have the $10 million for DCFS to provide specialized C-sex services within child welfare. This is a huge package that no other state has, but we have to make sure we continue that as a resource. And we did not get the $10 million as a continuing budget request, so that's going to be our request this year. And the last thing, and I'm going to pass out papers on this after the panel, is our push for legislative change this year is really on a comprehensive, and it's not, I want to be very careful because we are barred by some of our funders in speaking about decriminalization of prostitution, but the idea of decriminalizing trafficking survivors for crimes their traffickers force them to commit. So I have to tell you that our data is showing, and it will show you in the papers I'm passing around, that some of our victims are being arrested 40 to 50 times, and that on average for crimes related to trafficking, it's 16 times. And so this is a waste of our public resources, and these kind of crimes follow them for their whole life. So any idea out there that says that arresting a victim to get them into services, to get them away from the trafficker, is not an empowerment approach, and it is one that we as a legislature cannot continue to take. We have to draw clear lines so that our law enforcement can be properly trained on this, and we can come up with other statewide responses. So our recommendations are outlined in those.
You have some tremendous recommendations. My chief of staff, Tomas, is in the corner there. If you could work with her over the next time, certainly talk today, but over the next couple of months, all of your recommendations make sense to me. Particularly, I want to understand why expungement's not working, how we would have to change the law so judges would see that. I'm worried about people being arrested for things that they're forced to do repeatedly. Don't know what the answers to all of those are, but these are definitely things that I personally would like to work with, and I imagine members of my committee would as well. Ms. Lopez, Santiago, Joan Sawyer here today. I think these are things that we all have great concerns about as well. Senator Huff, who is sitting right behind you. So I think you brought up some tremendously important items that could be very helpful to us, and I definitely want to be working on them. Next, we have either Nilda Valmoras or who would like to, well, why don't you speak next, Nilda?